The hum of the aircraft was steady, almost soothing as families buckled in and business travelers checked their emails. Overhead bins clicked shut, safety instructions were still echoing faintly, and the plane was minutes from takeoff. In the middle rows sat a young black boy, no older than 12, wearing a bright hoodie and clutching a backpack like it was a lifeline. His mother leaned toward him, whispering reassurance, reminding him they were on their way to see his grandmother. It was supposed to be a normal flight, a routine trip, nothing more. But then, everything changed. A flight attendant, with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze, stopped at their row. She looked at the boy, not with kindness or patience, but with suspicion. Her tone was clipped as she questioned him, her words louder than necessary, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. His mother tried to answer politely, explaining, but the attendant's face hardened. She leaned closer, voice rising, as though the child's very presence offended her. The boy's eyes darted nervously toward his mother, but he stayed still, trying not to make things worse. The atmosphere shifted. Conversations around them hushed. People began to watch. And then, in one shocking, unprovoked moment, the flight attendant lashed out. Her hand struck him across the face with brutal force. The crack was sickening. The boy's head snapped to the side, and a cry tore from his lips as he clutched his jaw. Gasps filled the cabin. A woman in the next row covered her mouth. A man 2 seats ahead muttered in disbelief. The boy's mother screamed his name, reaching for him as tears streamed down his cheeks. The once calm cabin had turned into a scene of stunned silence and horror. The flight attendant, instead of apologizing, crossed her arms, glaring down as though she had done nothing wrong. The arrogance in her stance was undeniable. She seemed convinced her authority would shield her, that no one would dare to challenge her. But what she didn't realize, what not a single passenger yet knew, was that sitting just a few rows away was someone who could change everything. A federal judge, watching quietly, had seen it all. And he was about to make sure the skies would never be the same.
The boy sat trembling in his seat, his small hands cupping his swollen jaw as tears rolled down his cheeks. His mother's voice cracked with anger and fear, demanding help, demanding answers, demanding humanity. But the flight attendant who had struck her son doubled down instead of backing away. Her chin lifted higher, her words sharper, echoing through the cabin like shards of glass. "This boy was out of control," she snapped, her tone dripping with disdain. "I acted appropriately. He needs to learn how to behave." The passengers shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the truth. The boy hadn't moved. He hadn't raised his voice. He had done nothing except exist in a space where she didn't want him. The injustice was raw, undeniable, and it seared itself into the minds of everyone watching. His mother pleaded again, her voice breaking. "He's just a child. He didn't do anything. Please, he's hurt. He needs a doctor." But the attendant refused to bend. Instead, she threatened to have them removed from the plane, her voice booming with authority she thought no one would dare to question. The mother's face flushed with humiliation as dozens of strangers looked on. Some whispered words of support. "This isn't right. That's too far." But others kept their eyes down, too afraid or too indifferent to intervene. For the boy, the humiliation cut deeper than the pain. He had dreamed of this trip for weeks, telling his friends at school about visiting his grandmother. Now his joy was being stolen in front of everyone. The betrayal by someone in uniform, someone entrusted with safety, was more than just cruelty. It was a lesson forced upon him far too young, that dignity could be denied in an instant because of the color of his skin. The tension thickened. The mother pressed a trembling hand against her son's shoulder, whispering, "Stay strong, baby. Stay strong." Her words were steady, but her eyes betrayed the storm within. And still the flight attendant pressed on, her arrogance growing with every second. She saw the other passengers watching, but she mistook their silence for consent. She leaned closer, her voice low and cutting. "If you can't control your son, maybe you shouldn't be flying at all." The audacity struck like another blow, leaving the mother frozen in shock. The humiliation was complete. A family vacation meant to bring joy had been shattered in front of an entire plane full of strangers. But arrogance has a way of planting the seeds of its own downfall. What the attendant didn't know, what none of the crew could have guessed, was that their attempt to silence this family had been witnessed by a man who carried more power than their entire airline chain of command combined. A man trained to weigh truth and lies, justice and cruelty. The silence in the cabin deepened as eyes darted between the crying child, the enraged mother, and the rigid flight attendant. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath, sensing that the fragile balance was about to break. The humiliation of one family was about to ignite a firestorm that would engulf the airline. Because the boy's pain wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the airline's worst nightmare.
She had been with the airline for over a decade, a senior attendant who wore her navy blue uniform like armor. To most passengers, she projected authority. Her clipped tone, her efficient stride down the aisle, the way she shut down requests with a tight smile. But beneath that polished exterior simmered something darker, a superiority she never quite concealed, especially toward passengers who didn't look like her idea of belonging. Colleagues whispered about it in break rooms. They noticed the patterns. She was quick to scold black families for the smallest infractions. She rolled her eyes when Latino parents asked for an extra snack for their children. She made passengers who spoke broken English feel like an inconvenience instead of customers who had paid just like anyone else. It wasn't always blatant, but it was there, in her sighs, in her stares, in the subtle cruelty of her words. There had been complaints, more than a few. A couple had even escalated to management. But the culture of the airline was built to protect its own. "She's a loyal employee," supervisors said. "She's just strict." Passengers were dismissed as exaggerating, too sensitive, or misunderstanding her intentions. The official reports vanished into files that never saw daylight, shielded by layers of bureaucracy. And yet, ironically, the airline loved to trumpet its commitment to diversity. Ad campaigns showed smiling crews of every race. Posters in airports declared, "Inclusion is our strength." But inside, on the planes themselves, the hypocrisy thrived. Diversity was a marketing tool, not a lived reality. Behind closed doors, arrogance reigned. Employees like her were emboldened to act however they pleased, confident that the company would close ranks around them if anything went wrong. She reveled in that shield. Each incident where she went unpunished made her bolder. Each silence from management became permission to escalate. She began to see herself not just as a rule enforcer, but as the ultimate arbiter of who deserved to fly. And in her mind, the boy and his family did not fit. That day, as she raised her voice and justified her violence, she felt untouchable. She believed the passenger's discomfort would fade, that the mother's anger would be dismissed as overreaction, that the boy's tears would be chalked up as childish dramatics. She had played this game before and always won. But arrogance blinds even the sharpest eyes. What she didn't realize was how visible she had made herself. Every word she spit, every ounce of venom she poured into that cabin was being absorbed by people who would not forget. A mother who would never forgive. A boy who would carry the scar far beyond the flight. Passengers who would post and share until her face became a symbol of cruelty. And most dangerously of all, a federal judge sitting just rows away, watching everything with silent, simmering fury. The airline itself was complicit. It had built her confidence brick by brick, complaint by ignored complaint. By refusing to confront her prejudice, by burying its own contradictions under glossy press releases, it had created the perfect storm. A culture that pretended to celebrate equality while nurturing inequality in practice. A company that praised inclusion while protecting exclusion. She thought she was untouchable. She thought this incident would vanish like all the others. But history has a way of catching up, and arrogance has a way of walking right into its own downfall. Because in that cabin, her performance of superiority was about to collide with the one truth she could never control: the law. And the man who embodied it had already made up his mind. What she believed was just another routine act of cruelty was in fact the beginning of her unraveling. She had no idea she was picking the wrong family, at the wrong time, with the wrong witness watching every move.
The boy at the center of it all was just 12 years old. He was slender, shy, and carried himself with the awkward grace of someone still growing into his own skin. That morning before the flight, he had been buzzing with excitement. His backpack was stuffed with snacks his grandmother loved, his sneakers freshly cleaned by his mother the night before. He had told anyone who would listen at school that he was flying to see his grandmother. And now, in that cabin, all that joy was bleeding away under the weight of someone else's hate. He came from a family that had built its life on hard work and quiet pride. His mother, a nurse who often worked double shifts, had instilled in him the values of dignity and respect. No matter what, she always told him, carry yourself with pride. Don't let anyone make you feel smaller than you are. His father, though often away due to work, echoed the same. To them, resilience wasn't just advice. It was survival. The boy's childhood wasn't lavish, but it was rich in lessons. His parents taught him to love books, to respect his elders, to believe in himself even when the world refused to see him. He dreamed of becoming an architect, sketching buildings in the margins of his notebooks. He was soft-spoken, polite, and curious, the kind of child teachers described as a joy to have in class. And yet, at 12, he had already begun to notice how differently the world treated him compared to some of his classmates. This flight was supposed to be a rare escape. His mother had scraped together enough money for the trip, excited to bring her son to see family he hadn't hugged in years. For them, it wasn't just a vacation. It was a reward for everything they had endured. They had earned this moment of joy. But joy for families like theirs was often fragile. The humiliation in the cabin wasn't just about the blow that fractured his jaw. It was about the message that came with it. That his existence was a threat, that his innocence could be rewritten as defiance, that his pain could be dismissed. And for his mother, watching it unfold, it was an unbearable echo of the lessons she had worked so hard to shield him from. She had grown up hearing stories of discrimination, warnings from her parents about the dangers of standing out in the wrong space. She had hoped, desperately, that her son might be spared from those lessons until he was older. Instead, here it was, forced upon him in front of dozens of strangers. And yet, even as the boy sobbed quietly into his mother's shoulder, something deeper was building inside the family. Their story was not one of victimhood, but of resilience. His mother refused to cower, even when threatened with removal. She held her head high, her voice steady, daring the world to look away. "My son deserves to be here," she repeated, each word a strike against the injustice. Their strength didn't come from wealth or influence. It came from survival, from generations who had endured worse and still pressed forward. What the flight attendant saw as weakness was in fact unshakable resolve. The boy might have been young, but he was not powerless. He was being raised in a home where dignity was non-negotiable, where silence was never the answer, where standing tall, even with a broken jaw, was the only choice. And unbeknownst to the flight attendant, the man sitting a few rows away had already taken note of that strength. A federal judge, used to weighing evidence and intent, was watching this family not with pity, but with respect. He saw the injustice clearly, but he also saw something else. The quiet defiance in the boy's eyes, the unyielding courage in his mother's voice. It was the kind of resilience that no prejudice could erase. That moment would become the turning point of their lives. The boy's innocence was bruised, but it was not destroyed. Instead, it was tempered into something stronger. His mother's fury would transform into a fight for justice, and the authority the flight attendant thought she wielded without consequence was about to collapse under the weight of truth. Because when that judge reached for his phone, when he began making the calls that would shatter the silence, the trajectory of the entire story shifted. The boy's pain was real, the humiliation was scarring, but their family's strength was greater still. And when his father's phone rang that afternoon, and the story reached the ears of someone with both power and love in equal measure, everything began to change. The hum of the engines was drowned out by the rising tension inside the cabin. The boy, clutching his swollen jaw, whispered that he wanted to go home. His mother's voice wavered, but she refused to give in. "We're not leaving," she said firmly, her words carrying further than she intended. "We bought these tickets, we belong here." The flight attendant, flushed with indignation, squared her shoulders and barked back. "You don't tell me how this works. If you don't comply, you'll both be removed." Her voice was sharp, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Passengers froze in their seats. Some turned away, but others began to whisper, the unease rippling like a current through the rows. The mother stood, trembling but defiant, her hand resting on her son's shoulder. "All I'm asking is for my child to be treated with respect. He's hurt. He needs help." Her plea was both dignified and desperate, and it landed in the ears of the passengers like a challenge they couldn't ignore. A man in the aisle seat leaned forward and muttered, "She's right. This isn't okay." Another passenger nodded silently, but the voices were hushed, uncertain. Most stayed quiet, fearful of being dragged into conflict with airline staff who held power over their travel. The attendant smirked, as if the whispers of dissent only fueled her certainty. She bent low, her finger stabbing the air toward the mother. "If you don't calm down, you'll never board another plane with this airline again." The words weren't just a threat. They were meant to humiliate, to remind the family that she held the power in this confined space. The boy, silent until now, lifted his head. His eyes glistened with tears, but there was a spark in them, the quiet defiance his parents had nurtured in him all his life. "We didn't do anything wrong," he said softly, his voice breaking, but audible enough to cut through the tension. The simplicity of it pierced the room like a blade. Passengers shifted again. The truth was undeniable, spoken plainly by a child's innocence had been stolen in front of their eyes. The attendant's face hardened. Her authority was slipping, and she could feel it. She doubled down, louder, angrier, mocking the boy's words. "Nothing wrong? You don't even understand what wrong looks like." The cruelty was too much. Gasps rippled through the rows. The mother's fists clenched, but she held her composure, knowing that if she lost control, they would use it against her. Instead, she steadied her son, whispering, "Don't let her take your strength." The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting had been. All eyes were on the family now. The attendant, sensing her grip on the situation faltering, stood taller, trying to reassert dominance, but her arrogance had already begun to curdle into fear. She didn't realize it yet, but the ground beneath her was shifting. The boy glanced at his mother, then reached for the phone tucked into his backpack. His hand shook, but his resolve was clear. He dialed a number, lifted the phone to his ear, and waited. The sound of ringing filled the silence in his mind. Passengers leaned forward, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. The attendant smirked, about to unleash another cutting remark.
But then she froze, noticing the boy's expression change as someone answered on the other end. The cabin seemed to stop breathing. The boy whispered into the phone, his voice trembling but steady enough to carry. "Dad, it happened again." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The attendant blinked, her confidence faltering for the first time. The passengers sat rigid, their curiosity burning. They didn't know who Dad was. They didn't know what power his voice carried. But they were about to find out. And in that suspended moment, as the boy clutched the phone and the cabin fell silent, the balance of power shifted. Because silence had finally given way to a call that would change everything.
The boy's small voice trembled through the receiver, but the weight of his words carried far beyond his years. "Dad, it happened again." He didn't need to explain further. On the other end of the line, his father's breath stilled. This wasn't the first time his family had been humiliated in public, but it was the first time his son had spoken those words with a broken jaw. For a man who had spent his life building justice brick by brick in the courtroom, who had risen to the rank of federal judge through discipline and principle, this call was not just a plea from his child, it was a demand for truth to rise above arrogance. His voice came steady, calm, deliberate. "Put your mother on the phone." The mother's hand shook as she took the phone from her son. Her eyes glistened. Her voice quivered as she spoke. "She hit him. She called him out in front of everyone, and now she's threatening to throw us off this plane." There was a pause on the line. Then the judge's tone hardened. "Stay where you are. Don't move. This is about to be handled." Within moments, his calls began. To the airline's headquarters, to the regional operations director, to contacts in federal oversight offices who knew his name well. Each call was precise, measured, heavy with the authority of a man who didn't raise his voice, but left no doubt about his power. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The attendant tried to continue her tirade, but the words faltered as she noticed the mother's face change, calm settling in where there had been only fear. The boy, jaw aching, leaned against his mother, whispering, "Dad's got it." Passengers whispered among themselves, curiosity buzzing through the rows. Who did he call? What's happening? Why does she look so nervous now? It began with a flight supervisor rushing down the aisle, his headset crackling, his expression pale. He leaned in to whisper urgently into the attendant's ear. She stiffened, her bravado slipping for the first time. She stammered, What do you mean headquarters is asking for me?" Her voice cracked with a tremor of disbelief. Words spread like wildfire. Murmurs passed from row to row, tension rising with every second. "Something's going on. She's in trouble. This is bigger than we thought." The boy's father had set off alarms at the highest level. At headquarters, executives scrambled, phones lighting up with alerts. Legal advisors demanded immediate details. Public relations teams braced for impact. They all understood one thing. When a federal judge called, it wasn't just a complaint, it was a reckoning. In the cabin, the transformation was cinematic. The attendant who had once stood tall, lording her authority over a defenseless boy, now shrank under the weight of her own collapsing arrogance. Her eyes darted nervously. Her hands fidgeted. Her voice faltered when she tried to bark orders. Passengers noticed, and whispers turned into stares. She was unraveling, and the entire cabin was watching. The supervisor returned, his tone clipped and urgent. "You need to step aside, now." She sputtered, "I was just doing my job." But her words were drowned by silence, the silence of passengers who had seen enough, the silence that screamed louder than any accusation. The mother rose slowly, dignity radiating from her as she steadied her son. Together they stood in the aisle, no longer shrinking under humiliation, but elevated by truth. Every eye in the cabin followed them, passengers leaning forward, as if they too were rising with the family. And then came the announcement, crackling through the intercom with the weight of finality. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unforeseen situation, this flight will be delayed until further notice. Please remain seated. Gasps filled the cabin. Delayed? Because of this? Because of them? The attendant's face drained of color. She knew what it meant. This was no ordinary delay. Headquarters had intervened. Flights don't stop for one complaint, unless the voice behind that complaint carried the force of the law. The boy, still clutching his jaw, watched as the same woman who had mocked him now stood paralyzed, stripped of power. For the first time, he wasn't the one shrinking in his seat. She was. And in that reversal, dignity reclaimed its place. Passengers pulled out their phones, recording the moment, capturing the fall of arrogance in real time. A mother holding her son close, a worker silenced by her own cruelty, and the cabin vibrating with the knowledge that something extraordinary was happening. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then the supervisor returned once more, this time addressing the entire cabin. His voice was tense but respectful. "We sincerely apologize for the situation. The matter is being addressed at the highest level. Please bear with us." Passengers exchanged glances. The highest level? The speculation buzzed. Whoever was on the other end of that boy's phone just grounded a plane. The boy leaned into his mother's side, his voice soft but resolute. "We're going to be okay, Mama." And they were, because in that moment, the truth had shattered arrogance. The oppressor's voice had collapsed into silence, and dignity had reclaimed the space it was always meant to hold. But this was only the beginning. The cabin had fallen silent, but outside those walls, the story was about to erupt. Into headlines, into hashtags, into a national conversation that the airline could no longer control. The delay stretched on, and with it, the ripple of whispers grew into a storm. Passengers began recording, their cameras capturing every glance, every nervous shuffle from the crew, every quiet tear the mother wiped from her son's face. Those recordings didn't stay on the plane. They traveled, almost instantly, to millions of screens. Within hours, hashtags began to trend. Justice in the sky, flying while black. Clips of the boy holding his swollen jaw circulated on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Comment sections flooded with rage. How could this happen? Unacceptable. Ground every one of their planes. It wasn't just anger. It was recognition. People saw their own children in that boy, their own families in that mother's trembling hands. The internet carried the pain beyond the cabin, transforming it into a collective roar. News outlets picked it up next. Flight attendant accused of assaulting black child mid-air. Headlines scrolled across screens in airports, living rooms, phones resting on kitchen counters. The story wasn't just a local embarrassment. It was a national crisis. Anchors spoke in grave tones. Analysts discussed systemic racism in customer service industries, and commentators asked the question out loud, how many more times before this stops? At airline headquarters, the fallout was immediate. Executives huddled in crisis meetings, voices clashing over speakerphones. Legal teams scrambled to assess liability. Public relations scrambled harder to craft a statement that could stem the outrage. "We deeply regret," one draft began, only to be rejected as too weak. "We stand against discrimination," another said, but even the executives knew words alone couldn't undo what had unfolded in front of hundreds of recording passengers. Meanwhile, the workers involved were suspended pending investigation. The flight attendant who had once shouted orders now sat in silence, her name whispered through newsrooms and message boards. She wasn't just a uniform anymore. She was a symbol, a face of cruelty caught on camera. And yet, through the chaos, something remarkable emerged. The boy and his mother remained dignified. In every interview, every witness statement, they refused to meet hate with hate. The mother's voice carried both pain and strength. My son didn't deserve this. No child does. But we will not be silent. Those words cut deeper than any accusation. They transformed the conversation from outrage into something larger, into a movement. People didn't just call for one airline's accountability. They demanded systemic change. They demanded training, reforms, protections for passengers of color who had too often been told their dignity was expendable at 30,000 feet. The story spread across dinner tables, classrooms, and workplaces. Black families spoke about the fears they carried whenever they traveled. Immigrant families recalled their own humiliations in airports. White allies joined the chorus, realizing silence made them complicit. The debate wasn't confined to screens anymore. It was lived, felt, breathed in every corner of the country. The airline eventually issued its apology. Broadcast across all major networks, the CEO appeared solemn, regret etched across his face. We are profoundly sorry for what occurred on our flight. We are committed to ensuring this never happens again. But the apology rang hollow to many. Words without justice were just noise. Protesters gathered outside airports, their signs sharp and clear. Dignity is not optional. Flying is a right, not a privilege for some. Still, even amid outrage, hope found its way forward. Communities rallied, inspired by the resilience of a boy who had endured humiliation yet held his head high. Teachers played clips in classrooms, reminding students of the importance of standing up, even when it feels impossible. Clergy wove the story into sermons, calling it proof that injustice can be confronted and overturned. And through it all, the boy's father, still quiet, still measured, let the system feel his weight. The investigations would not be rushed, the accountability would not be delayed, and the reckoning would not be silenced. The flight might have been grounded, but the movement it sparked was airborne. It stretched beyond one airline, beyond one incident, beyond even one family. It became part of the larger truth. Racism thrives in silence, but it collapses when exposed. But through all the chaos, one image endured above all others. The boy standing beside his mother, jaw swollen, eyes steady, dignity intact. He hadn't chosen this fight, but by standing tall, he became a symbol of millions. And in that symbol, a nation found itself asking, if a child can carry himself with dignity in the face of hate, what excuse do the rest of us have for staying silent? But this story was still unfolding, still carrying forward into the next chapter, because dignity doesn't just survive injustice, it inspires the courage to change it.
The storm of outrage had reached its peak, but in the quiet that followed, the deeper truth came into focus. What happened on that flight wasn't just an isolated clash between a boy and a flight attendant. It was the collision of two forces, arrogance and prejudice on one side, dignity and resilience on the other. And in that collision, the world saw which one truly held power. The boy's father, a federal judge, could have unleashed his authority in anger. He could have used the law as a weapon, tearing down everyone involved with a stroke of the gavel. But instead, he chose something different. He chose to remind the country that justice is strongest when it is rooted not in revenge, but in accountability and truth. His first public words weren't filled with fury. They were steady, measured, and impossible to ignore. My son deserved safety. Every child deserves dignity. That is non-negotiable.
Those words carried weight because they reached beyond the family itself. They touched parents everywhere who saw themselves in that moment. They spoke to immigrants who had once stood in lines, treated as less than human. They spoke to workers who had swallowed discrimination for the sake of keeping their jobs. And they spoke to allies who had once stayed silent, urging them that silence is no longer an option. The lesson became clear. Injustice humiliates, but it cannot define. The cruelty of that moment, the raised voice, the violent hand, the arrogance of power had been meant to reduce the boy, to shrink his humanity into nothing more than a problem on a plane. But instead, it had revealed the exact opposite. His composure became proof that dignity is stronger than hate. His quiet resilience became a mirror that forced the world to look at itself. And through that reflection, hope began to rise. Schools used the story as a teaching moment about courage and empathy. Families spoke to their children about the importance of standing tall, even when the world tries to push them down. Community leaders used it to rally for reforms, demanding airlines and institutions alike confront the prejudice baked into their systems. The father's example as both a parent and a judge revealed another powerful truth. Justice isn't just a courtroom word. It's not something reserved for legal arguments in polished chambers. Justice is the everyday decision to say, this is wrong and we won't accept it. It's the courage of witnesses who record injustice, the strength of a mother who refuses to be silent, and the resilience of a child who carries himself with unshaken dignity. The moral echoed across the nation. Silence allows hate to thrive, but courage exposes it. And once exposed, hate cannot withstand the weight of truth. For many, this story became more than news. It became a reminder that progress is not born from comfort. It is born from confrontation, when the powerless refuse to bow, when the humiliated rise, when the silenced speak. That boy did not choose to be humiliated, but his dignity in the face of it became the spark that ignited change. And so the resolution was not simply that an airline apologized or that an employee was disciplined or that the law would take its course. The true resolution was the shift in hearts and minds. The reminder that humanity cannot be boarded, ticketed, or denied. This story left behind a message for every viewer, every listener, every person scrolling past the headlines. You may not wear a robe of justice, you may not hold corporate power, but you hold something greater, the ability to speak, to stand, to refuse silence. Injustice can strike anywhere, but so can courage. And when dignity stands firm, even in the smallest of voices, it echoes louder than hate ever could. That was the legacy of one boy on one flight. A legacy that tells us all, injustice may humiliate, but it cannot define. Dignity will always rise. And as this chapter closed, the stage was set for one final reminder, an outro that would call every listener to carry the lesson forward, to ensure this story was not just remembered, but acted upon. Airline denies twin black girls, but one call brings flights to a halt. The headline itself sounded like fiction, yet it was real. A single act of arrogance had collided with the truth too powerful to suppress. The oppressors tried to reduce two children to nothing more than troublemakers, but the truth shattered their authority in front of the world. And that is the essence of this story. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it begins with a quiet call, a steady voice on the other end of the line that refuses to let humiliation stand. Sometimes it begins with a child's dignity shining brighter than an oppressor's rage. We saw arrogance exposed. We saw cruelty crumble. But most importantly, we saw how dignity, courage, and resilience can flip the balance of power in an instant. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it.
Speak it. Carry it forward. Every view, every voice, every repost becomes another crack in the walls that racism hides behind. Silence allows injustice to thrive, but your voice can help expose it. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in stories where dignity triumphs over hate. Join a community that refuses to look away, that chooses courage over silence, that demands a better world. Because in the end, this isn't just about one family, one flight, or one airline. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of world we are willing to accept, and the kind of world we are determined to create. The flights may have been halted that day, but the movement for justice cannot be stopped. And together, with courage and dignity, we can make sure of it.